Welcome to Multifamily Revealed, a special podcast mini-series where we take you inside the journey of acquiring Emerald Point, a 76-unit multifamily property. I'm Anita Wong, real estate investor, syndicator, and your co-host.
And I'm Edison Miguel from Blue Ember Partners and your co-pilot for this series. We're here to pull back the curtains on what it really takes to close a multifamily deal like this.
So grab your favorite drink, get comfy, and let's dive in. Welcome back, friends, to our Emerald Point mini-series about the acquisition of our 76-unit apartment in the DFW area. If you are just joining us for the first time, we are alas at our final episode, but fear not, because we'll be posting a bonus episode of all about our 90 days post-acquisition takeover, which is going to be a live recording. I'm here with my co-host, Edison Miguel of Blue Ember Partners. Say hi, Edison.
Hello.
Again, today we're tackling one of the most daunting yet critical parts of multifamily syndications, capital raising. And to talk about this topic with us, we're bringing on, for the first time ever since our 3 seasons of the SARE Ladies podcast, my husband and CIO of Give Rise Capital, William Liu. Say hi.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Anita, for finally bringing me on. It's taken a little bit of time, but we're finally here.
And for those that don't know you, can you tell them a bit about who you are before multifamily syndication career?
Sure. So I've had the pleasure of being able to do corporate marketing for about 20 plus years. Started out in the military as a psychological operations specialist, then kind of transitioned to some startups, or really kind of focused really more on digital performance marketing. Somewhere along the way, got my MBA from Duke, and then last 7-8 years, I've been working in higher education, with my last posting as Chief Marketing Officer.
Thanks for sharing. There's actually a lot of things I didn't know about you, Will. Wow. But so before we really dive in, I think it'd be really helpful for our new investors listening if we can set the stage and explain what is capital raising and why it's so important in syndications.
Yeah, that's a great question. So essentially, when you kind of think about syndication is just a bunch of investors pulling together their resources, in this case, capital, together to be able to buy an asset that they couldn't buy just by themselves. And so capital raising is essentially just making sure that people are aware that you have a deal in hand, and making sure that they're actually be able to commit and be able to send you the funds to be able to acquire the asset, since that is one part of the capital stack. So you think about the capital raise portion of it, and then what your debt structure is, whether that's agency loan or a bridge loan, that essentially kind of makes up the capital stack there.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to summarize everything. So, I mean, before we kind of dive into the nitty gritty of things, we all raised together, right? So I just want to kind of get everyone's sense of what they felt now it's been post 90 days out. What did you think about the raise? And I can also start, right? So I think when I first started the capital raise, I was super nervous to start with, but I think it was shocking to me how the pieces really came together. I think the sentiment in the market at the time was that it's a really hard time to raise. And we had friends who are really well versed in the capital raising world be like, we're only really raising about 50% of the expected capital that we typically raise. And so for us, it was just like, I was like, we were largely untested. I mean, we did have experience on the team, but I think it was really impressive. I think for us that we were able to fulfill the raise in the weeks, not months, the weeks that we completed it, right? And I'll say one of my favorite memories of the raise was, so it happened to be timed with one of my biggest events, SARECon, which happens every year. And the raise just happened to be around the same time. And I remember we were going to do an in-person presentation in Orange County, and we purchased like 200 spring rolls from this restaurant called Brodards. And if you don't know, it's like a cult restaurant. Anyway, we purchased like way too many spring rolls, 200 spring rolls. And then we filled the entire room, standing room only, for our presentation. So that was super fun. It was chaotic, but it was super fun.
But all the spring rolls got eaten.
I know. I was like, Tony was like, how 200 spring rolls is way too many. I'm like, no, it isn't. Anyway, Edison, what was your sentiment about it?
First of all, that was definitely my highlight of the year. We love Brodard, and I've never seen so many spring rolls in one place before like that, in one sitting. The thing that we really learned was the importance of our branding. We're still definitely learning it. I think that is one of the biggest drivers of just really getting our investors and our community to really understand what we're doing. And it was a good thing that we started very early compared to if we were just to start multifamily and building our community that day versus a year ago. A lot of our friends and family, they're interested in owning real estate, but they don't want to manage property managers. They don't want to manage tenants. And they really don't want to answer those late night calls about a property issue. They just want to invest in real estate without having to deal with those tenants and property managers. So just sharing what we were doing a year ago and kind of really telling them and just sharing our journey of learning, the people we were networking, the markets that we were looking at really helped kind of already start building our brand very early on. And it made it that much easier for us to let them know, like, hey, we actually have a deal, versus compared to if they never knew what we were doing and we just kind of brought the deal straight to them.
Yeah, I think
How
that's
about
a
you, Will?
great I think that's a great point. Like being able to kind of do the pre-raising before the actual capital raising, because I don't know if a lot of people are, if they haven't done it before, you essentially have to raise millions of dollars in the span of 7 to 8 weeks, which is very, very difficult. So I think I was talking with a fellow investor earlier this week, and you kind of either on the capital raise, either you're very overconfident or you're very conservative about what you can kind of bring in. And so I definitely rode that wave of emotions. Like initially it was like very, very optimistic because like, hey, we got a lot of softness coming in. And then it was like trying to like follow up with people. And then it's not like people were ghosting us, but they're busy with their lives, right? With their jobs, with their families, they have other commitments. And they're like, they don't have time to read through like an 80-page PPM document to say like, hey, I want to be able to sign this contract. So, which is understandably. And then, or we had other issues maybe with the loan proceeds. So it was kind of riding the ups and downs. So I look back at it more fondly and then more relieved that we're done with that phase. But it was very stressful, is what I would say.
Definitely. Will, going back to the mechanics of the raise, what did the timeline for our capital raise look like, and how did we determine the amount to raise, and what were our minimum investment thresholds?
Yeah, great question. So I actually counted it. It took us about 53 days from when we first did our first webinar to when we last received our last funds from our investor. So that's basically about 7 to 8 weeks that it took, and we figured out what we needed from a raise standpoint, purely from our underwriting as well as doing our site visits or due diligence. So it really kind of fluctuated. So I think originally we actually had a little bit under 3 million, and then it kind of went up a little bit because our loan proceeds kind of went down because of some of the seller NOI issues. But we kind of fluctuated. But to answer the question about the minimum threshold, I think this is where I give huge kudos to Anita for setting it at 100,000, because I think it made it easier to not have to chase more people. It was chasing less people because it was $100,000 check instead of like a 50 or 25. So it just made it a bit more manageable during the capital raise process. I definitely would advise people to consider higher thresholds or at least have multiple tiers.
Yeah, and I think that was a challenge. That was a challenging decision for me, I think, as a lead GP for this deal and how we wanted to raise, because 100,000 is pretty much on the higher tier of minimum thresholds, right? There's a lot of people that raise 25,000, 50,000, and I think it was a vote of confidence for the entire team to just be like, okay, that's our minimum. Because I think what we do notice is that, like, people, especially when they're just kind of getting to start to know you, they're just gonna test it out, just a toe in the water, and so they're gonna reach real quick for the bottom of that barrel, just to participate, right? And so, so I think by setting it higher, in the future also we don't have to deal with as many investors, which means it's easier operationally, but it's also just helps us chase bigger fish bigger fish, right? And not to say we definitely fluctuated a little bit, and we were hardline, but we're also like we also made some exceptions for people that we really thought we wanted to be part of this deal. And we're really glad that we did, because I think it's also like a long-term relationship, right? But the general guideline was 100,000. So I'm glad that we ended up going there, because because as there's too many investors, it really gets way too hard to deal with. And that was something that previous indicators have dealt with when they're just shelling out dozens and dozens of K1s through the next year, right? So
And this is a good example of like aggressive versus conservative, right? So you kind of get the balance of it. But like I said, I give huge kudos to Anita for kind of putting that as like, hey, I think this is where we should set the mark, and I think it was a great idea.
Yeah. So I think in the beginning, one of the ideas that made me most nervous, obviously, was asking people for money. And it's such an emotional process too, because you feel like you're jumping in this really exciting deal, and then people, may or may not be able to shell out that money. And it's a big step, especially when you're asking friends and family for six figures to invest with you. And so I think one thing I did learn too was that, like, it's not personal sometimes, right? Sometimes we're just like, a deal just popped up and we have to raise in less than 2 weeks, and it's people don't have that much money just sitting around, or it may just not be a good time, or they're really busy with other things. So like, it was a learning process for me to be like, don't get tied too emotionally with with what people respond to you, right? But what were the things, Will, that made us successful, that we were able to get over sort of that hump of asking people for money?
I think that's a good question. I think like kind of what comes top of mind is kind of similar to what Edison mentioned in the beginning was, and I give again more credit to Anita than myself, but really just putting it out in the universe that this is something that we were interested in doing. We were wanting to kind of go in the multifamily space. If you seen any of Anita's emails, Instagram, anything over the last like few years, it always kind of mentioned about like, hey, we're kind of diving into syndication. So it made people really aware that was something that you just weren't like dabbling in, but you were actually passionate about pursuing. And then actually being able to then present to them, hey, here's everything that we did due diligence wise. So really kind of combine both of the, hey, they have the awareness, but also, hey, we did our homework. And so this is why we feel this is a good property asset to invest in, and also be able to put our own skin in the game too, right? I think that was an important distinction when I look back at it. I think if I remember correctly, like total wise, the GP team contributed over a third of the capital raise.
So one of the things for me, actually, as a new syndicator, and I kind of want to ask, I'm curious about you, Will, is how did you guys go about building credibility? So for us, we had a lot of our investors kind of asking, like, have you done this before? And as for me, as a new syndicator, I couldn't necessarily say, like, yeah, I've done this before, but we really leaned into our mentor, Tony Lin, and kind of really demonstrated that this is how Tony operates, and we operate very similarly. And one of the funniest things, or not funny, but it was a very great moment during our very first investor meeting, where we had one particular investor really drill into like the nitty gritties of everything in our deal, from the marketplace, the assumptions, down to literally the line item costs of renovations. And at the very end, just watching how Tony operated and how he answered the questions, and was really impressed with how Tony operated, kind of gave him the confidence that, oh, if these are the people that we're mentoring under, it gave him a lot of confidence, saying that we are probably being mentored by a great group of people. So how did you also go about building that confidence for your investors?
I think it was the same thing. And I actually remember that during the webinar, it was like a lot of like 20 questions game. I was like, anyone else? I want to ask a question too. But yeah, Tony handled it really well because he knows the market, he knows the space. He has other properties that he's invested in. So this isn't just something that he dabbles in, it's something that he knows, right? And so I think when you're first starting out, going from that 0 to 1, you that credibility. So you borrow someone else's credibility by having them as part of your sponsor team. And that was one co-lead this project with Tony, and also making sure that we brought in other Linfinity cohort students as well too, because we all shared the same values, right? We shared, and I think that's the most important thing. Like when you're kind of looking at it both from a GPN and LPN, these are your partners, and you are in a long-term relationship, as Anita mentioned, and you want to make sure that it's a good relationship that as it goes through its ups and downs, you have each other's backs.
And
Yeah,
how did go ahead?
Go ahead. Go ahead, Edison.
I was going to ask, Will, how exactly did you reach your potential investors and really keep them engaged throughout the entire process?
So I think what we did was just kind of I looked at it as kind of a marketing kind of situation, or like a marketing campaign. So we kind of used all the standard tactics of having a webinar, doing the follow-up, doing the one-on-one kind of communications within there. So it was kind of like you're not trying to eat the entire elephant like in one bite. You're just doing it one bit at a time, right? So it's like trying to get one investor at a time. Like, so one investor would say, hey, this is not a good time. And like Anita said, like it's not personal, but you just kind of move on to the next person. So I think something that Tony really mentioned was making sure that there's a buffer, making sure that there's a buffer of, hey, if you're trying to reach like 3 million, then maybe you try to raise for 3.5, because someone may fall out. And I think that was kind of in our situation where we actually kind of we overraised, and then we were like, all right, that's another problem we have, a good problem, but how do we be able to kind of carve out without necessarily kicking out an investor? Because to us that didn't feel good. So, and we ended up figuring it out. But I think that just kind of goes into making sure that you're planning appropriately.
Yeah, I think I want to tack onto that a little bit, because we did have some unexpected issues in escrow, right? Because we do set a certain bar of how much we need to raise, but that bar isn't standing still. It goes up and it goes down, right? It's based on how negotiations go with the deal, right? So I think when we first did our pitch, the price that we were at was 8.56. Now at the final 8.51, right? There's a lot of things that are going on between that. We are also at the mercy of our loan, right? We actually had to raise more because there were some adjustments with the rents that kind of flubbed while we were in escrow. So we actually had to raise more. So even though it did seem for a while that we were like, okay, we were fully committed, and then we had to open the doors a little bit more because things are in motion, right, Will?
Yeah, it's always be underwriting. Like that is kind of the key part of it, because the numbers will fluctuate. The assumptions will actually become actuals. Like using kind of insurance as a good example. Like we didn't actually bind that until like a few weeks beforehand. So, but that also kind of goes into our closing costs, our settlement, our final settlement statement, and we were working that to the last day. And so that's another story for another day. But it was, it's just trying to keep your head cool during these situations. Don't let emotions kind of override that. It's looking this as a business. Every situation, there's going to be some opportunities, there's going to be some obstacles, some challenges. Just kind of deal with them as they come along, and plan as much as you can.
Like you guys mentioned, there was definitely a lot of obstacles, and even the changing final price and the changing raise amount and all that. And it was definitely a lot of moving parts. You guys kind of mentioned of like a lot of lining up the ducks. How did we communicate and streamline the subscription process, letting our investors know the updates of everything going on with everything moving?
Great question. Again, I kind of go back to planning. So I think this is where like we were constantly updating our investors, no matter where they were in the funnel, saying like, hey, if you already sent in your money, this is where we're at. This is where the closing. This is where our new closing date is going to be, because our closing date did get moved back by a few weeks, and we did have to kind of go through multiple extensions. We were even out of extension for a little bit of time. But we were able to kind of work past it. We're updating our investors constantly before they had to ask, right? So, and I just kind of look at it the way of how do I want to be treated if I were in their situation? So, and if I was in their situation and I gave someone $100,000, $250,000, I want to make sure that they are a good steward of that investment and a good manager of that investment, right? So again, just kind of looking at it the way that you would want to be treated. So.
Yeah, I love that part because we were just talking. I had an earlier episode with Paul Peebles and Ashley Cow, and they've seen a lot of transactions, and we asked them, what are the attributes of a good versus a great syndicator, right? And the great syndicators are value transparency, right? It's like shady things are going down when nothing is said, right? And then suddenly a mountain of like news just or worse, you find out in the news what's going on in your property, right?
Yes.
Which probably has happened, right? So I always love that it's like we want to be answering the questions before the questions are even asked, because that's how we would want to be treated, and how much we all value as a GP team, value transparency, and just like I think what also drove us to really align with Tony is that, like, Tony, I think, said in the beginning, it was just like, people don't care that you have a problem. People just want to know that you're addressing it. And so I think it was always like, well, this is a problem, but this is how we're working on it. People don't want to know. People want to know that at least you see it, and then you're doing things in your power to address it. And if it goes well, great. If not, at least we know that you're paying attention. And I think that's what people value, what people care about, and also the kind of investors I really want to attract ourselves to. Right?
Yeah, and that kind of reminds, like, at the old Capital conference, like a few months ago, like I think it was Avery Johnson, the former basketball player, like who kind of has his own investment shop now, kind of mentions like, yeah, if you're not solving problems for your investors, you're creating problems, right? So, and that's kind of like a good mindset to be like, how do you be proactive? Can't figure out everything that's going to happen, but you can plan as much as you can, and just be as prepared for when that happens, and then just make sure that you're communicating, right? So, and I think that solves like 95% of the issues.
Mm-hmm. So what are the lessons that you're going to take from our current raise, and then what are you going to say for our next inevitable raise?
I would say pre-raise. So kind of like touching on what we said earlier, like just making sure people are aware that you're looking at deals, like trying to do those coffee chats, educating people, and so that way when you do have a deal come up, and it will come up really really fast, then you have all your ducks aligned, as Edison had mentioned earlier, right? So you're preparing yourself for that inevitability, whether that's whether for us it's like later this year or next year. Like, our intent is to acquire another property, right? So we're always going to be underwriting, we're going to be looking at deals. We know all the things that we need to do the property tours, build a relationship with the brokers. Those are all the things that we can control. Obviously, also be able to kind of make people aware that this is what we're doing, growing our newsletter, going to conference, doing all those things that may not be as sexy, but when a deal does come up, then we're able to execute on it very, very quickly.
Mm-hmm. And then what are your lessons that you would take for the next raise?
It's definitely our brand. Just saying it out, just letting people know what we're doing, definitely networking and really meeting more people. Not just like as investors, but just as a learning opportunity. You never know what you're going to learn from somebody, and you might just pick up a little tidbit from somebody you wouldn't even have known.
Mm-hmm.
What about you,
I
Anita?
think I would say, I think the pre-raising is definitely really important. I mean, I've mentioned this, but Perry Zhang, the CEO of Cashflow Portal, when I first started syndications, he told me the first thing you need to do is just get coffee with people. And even if it's like you don't have a deal in hand, at least you're just talking to them, right? And it's like if you have one coffee chat, two coffee chats a week, and you kind of just mention that this is what you're working on, kind of talk about maybe the market you're in, it sows the seed for what you are laying down, right? So then it helps you kind of flow into the conversation and pick it up the next time. So it's a lot of pre-work that is done in multifamily that really it really succeeds in a completed deal. Yeah.
Yeah, Anita said it right. Like you reap after you sow, right? So it's the prerequisite is that you sow first, right? So you have to do those things, even though it's not necessarily like again the most sexy thing, but it is those practices, those habits that eventually help you to kind of acquire a 76 unit multifamily property. So
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Okay, our last section. Rapid fire
oh,
questions. Yes.
all right.
um, okay, so you have 15 seconds to answer these questions. Yeah. All right, here we go. What is one business leader you admire? Who is one business leader you admire and why?
I would say Craig Rochelle, lead pastor of Life Church. He has a podcast and really love listening to all of that blend of business plus spiritual advice.
Okay. What is a lesson that a previous mentor gave you that you carry on to this day?
I think one of my former bosses, he always says like there's multiple paths to kind of get to where you want to go, but you have to know where you want to go first.
Okay. What is something every syndicator should do, but they don't?
Underwrite, underwrite, underwrite.
What about from like a marketing perspective? Do you have like something
Uh,
like
Yeah, I think it would probably go back to understanding why. I was actually just talking to one of my a fellow friend in a business school classmate. Who's like, why do you want to get into the commercial real estate or real estate kind of game, right? Like, what is your end goal? Is this financial freedom? Is this so you and your wife have something to pass on to your kids? Like, what is your end goal in mind, right? So and then kind of be able to work your way backwards. So it kind of goes back to know your purpose so that you can be able to communicate your values.
hmm. So that's like the more marketing advice, like just to know your why and as like
Yeah,
the compass for your brand. Yeah.
it's your branding essentially. When people think through about branding, and especially, and Edison actually mentioned it perfectly. Like it is tied in this game, it is tied to who you are as a person, right? So there is no, you can't really separate that. Like, hey, a company is like just like a company is very much tied to their founder, right? So and those that founder has that specific like whatever it is that they espouse, like that is kind of more or less what the company adopts.
It's pretty
Hmm.
interesting, Will, that you mentioned about that because I feel like it's the brands and values that actually bring teams together and not even just syndication teams, but also brokers and lenders.
Yes.
Hmm.
Anita and we came a podcast with Wes, and he really mentioned about the community and how he resonates with certain people in trying to build a better community in Dallas.
Yes. And that's something that Anita and I are also that resonates with us. That's the reason why we have Give Rise Capital. It is helping to give rise for everyone, not just ourselves, but our community too.
Yeah, and I think that's great because it's or what they say, it's like the energy you give out, the energy you attract, right? And I think that's also what kind of tethers us together as a GP team and helps us build relationships with the necessary people. All the parts that really need to make this happen in order to even play this game, you know. Um, but I think I love. I mean, just to wrap up, since we have been here for 5 episodes now, I think what I'm learning now is like how much this is about. I think it's about a principles game. It's about letting out who you are and in respecting other people and really living true to your principles and letting that sort of guide you into the relationships and building those
Mhm.
relationships, which hopefully end in a deal. But I think that it's all about that sort of positive energy and
Mhm.
respect that you give to other people. Yeah.
Definitely.
Okay, Edison.
So, Will, we really appreciate you being on our podcast. One thing that we really definitely all learned is pre-raise and always be underwriting. I think that's definitely the biggest tip that we have here. And for our listeners that want to get in touch with you, what's the best way they can reach you, Will?
Yeah, you can go to our website at giverisecapital.com, or you can reach me or Anita at William@giverisecapital or Anita@giverisecapital.com.
All right. Thanks, Will.
All
See
right,
you
thanks for
later.
having me on.
Bye.
Bye.